Sarah Mitchell had always been afraid of flying. The 17-year-old girl clutched her grandmother's rosary beads as Flight 447 climbed higher into the cloudy October sky. She was traveling alone from Chicago to Denver, visiting her sick aunt whom she hadn't seen in 3 years. Her parents had wanted to come along, but work commitments kept them back home. The Boeing 737 carried 156 passengers that Tuesday morning. Sarah sat in row 17, middle seat, squeezed between a businessman typing furiously on his laptop and an elderly woman knitting a bright yellow scarf. The plane had been in the air for about 40 minutes when Sarah noticed something strange happening in the cockpit area. Captain James Rodriguez had been flying commercial aircraft for 22 years. He knew every sound, every vibration, every tiny detail about how planes should behave during flight. That morning, he felt perfectly fine during the pre-flight checks. His co-pilot, David Chen, was younger but experienced, with 8 years of flying under his belt. Neither man had any idea what was about to happen. It started with a slight headache for Captain Rodriguez. Nothing serious, just a mild throbbing behind his left temple. He rubbed his forehead and continued monitoring the instruments. The weather ahead looked clear, and they were making good time. Everything seemed normal, until the headache suddenly became much worse. Sarah was trying to read her book when she heard a flight attendant walking quickly toward the front of the plane. The woman's face looked worried, which made Sarah feel nervous. She had always been good at reading people's expressions, a skill she learned from watching her mother, who worked as a nurse and could tell when patients were hiding pain. In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez felt dizzy. The instruments in front of him started to blur. He blinked several times, trying to clear his vision, but the dizziness got worse. His hands felt weak on the controls. Something was very wrong, but he couldn't understand what was happening to his body. Co-pilot Chen noticed immediately when his captain started acting strange. Rodriguez was normally very talkative and professional, always making small jokes during flights. But now he was quiet, gripping the armrests of his seat tightly, and his breathing had become shallow and quick. The businessman next to Sarah suddenly looked up from his computer. He had been a passenger on hundreds of flights and knew that flight attendants didn't usually move around with such worried expressions. The elderly woman stopped knitting and glanced toward the front of the plane. Other passengers were starting to notice that something felt different about this flight. Captain Rodriguez tried to speak to his co-pilot, but the words came out slurred and confused. He felt like his tongue was too big for his mouth. Chen immediately understood that this was a medical emergency. Without hesitation, he took control of the aircraft and called for the senior flight attendant. Jessica Williams had been a flight attendant for 12 years. She had seen medical emergencies before, but never involving a pilot. When Chen called her to the cockpit, she saw Captain Rodriguez slumped in his seat, conscious, but clearly in distress. His face was pale and sweaty, and he couldn't speak clearly. The co-pilot quickly explained the situation. They needed to make an emergency landing as soon as possible. Chen was perfectly capable of flying the plane alone, but airline safety rules required 2 pilots in the cockpit during critical phases like takeoff and landing. They were still over an hour away from Denver, and there were no suitable airports directly below them. Sarah felt the plane change direction slightly. Her stomach dropped, not from turbulence, but from a growing sense that something was seriously wrong. She had flown only 3 times in her life, but she knew that planes didn't usually change course without an announcement from the captain. Flight attendant Williams made the decision to ask if there were any doctors on board. Her voice over the intercom was calm and professional, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension. 2 passengers raised their hands, a retired cardiologist and a young resident from a Chicago hospital. The doctors examined Captain Rodriguez quickly. The cardiologist, Dr. Patricia Hayes, suspected that the captain was having a stroke. His symptoms: the slurred speech, weakness on one side of his body, and confusion, all pointed to a serious medical emergency that required immediate hospital treatment. Meanwhile, co-pilot Chen was dealing with a growing crisis. Air traffic control was trying to find the nearest airport that could handle their aircraft. The plane was flying over rural areas with small airports that couldn't accommodate a Boeing 737. They would have to continue flying for at least 30 more minutes before reaching a suitable landing strip. But then, something even worse happened. Co-pilot Chen started feeling sick too. It began with nausea, then dizziness, then the same weakness that had affected Captain Rodriguez. Within minutes, both pilots were unable to safely control the aircraft. Dr. Hayes quickly realized that both men had been poisoned or exposed to something toxic. She didn't know what had caused their symptoms, but she knew they needed immediate medical attention and couldn't continue flying. The plane was now flying on autopilot, but autopilot systems couldn't land the aircraft safely. Jessica Williams faced the most difficult decision of her career. She needed to find someone who could help land the plane. She made another announcement, asking if anyone on board had any flying experience. Several hands went up: a few private pilots, a retired military helicopter pilot, and a flight instructor. But then Sarah did something unexpected. She unbuckled her seatbelt and walked toward the front of the plane. The businessman and elderly woman watched in surprise as the teenager made her way down the aisle. Other passengers stared at her, wondering why such a young girl was moving around during what was clearly an emergency situation. Sarah had a secret that nobody on the plane knew about. For the past 2 years, she had been taking flying lessons at a small airport near her home. Her father, who was a mechanic for a small airline, had taught her the basics of aircraft operation. She had logged over 60 hours of flight time in small single-engine planes and had recently begun learning about larger aircraft systems. When she reached the front of the plane, Sarah quietly told Jessica Williams about her flying experience. The flight attendant was shocked. A 17-year-old girl was offering to help land a commercial aircraft carrying 156 people. It seemed impossible, but they were running out of options. The other passengers with flying experience were all trained on much smaller aircraft. The retired military pilot had flown helicopters, which operated very differently from airplanes. The private pilots had experience only with tiny 2- and 4-seat planes. Sarah was the only person on board who had specifically studied commercial aircraft operations, even though she had never actually flown one. Sarah's hands were shaking as she explained her qualifications to the flight attendant. She had spent countless hours studying aircraft manuals and flight procedures. Her father had brought home training materials from work, and she had memorized emergency procedures for various types of aircraft. She knew it was a long shot, but she also knew that someone had to try. The flight attendant made the difficult decision to let Sarah enter the cockpit. Dr. Hayes was still working with the two pilots, trying to stabilize their condition. Both men were conscious, but weak and confused. They couldn't provide much help, but they were alert enough to understand what was happening around them. Sarah had never been inside a real commercial aircraft cockpit before. The number of instruments, switches, and displays was overwhelming, but she recognized many of the basic controls from her studies. The autopilot was keeping the plane stable for now, but she knew they would need to take manual control soon to begin the landing process. Co-pilot Chen, despite his illness, managed to explain the basic controls to Sarah. His speech was slurred, but he could still think clearly enough to help guide her. He showed her the throttles, the control yoke, and the most important instruments she would need to monitor during landing. The plane was still flying toward Denver, but air traffic control had identified a closer airport that could handle their emergency. Colorado Springs Airport was about 20 minutes away and had a long runway suitable for their aircraft. The control tower there was already preparing for an emergency landing. Sarah sat in the co-pilot's seat, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the cockpit could hear it. She had dreamed of flying commercial aircraft since she was a little girl, but never imagined it would happen like this. The lives of 155 other people now depended on her ability to remember everything she had learned in her flying lessons. The radio crackled with voices from air traffic control and emergency response teams. Sarah listened carefully as the controllers gave her initial instructions for approaching the airport. Her voice was steady when she responded, even though inside she felt terrified. She knew that showing confidence was important, both for herself and for everyone who was depending on her. Time seemed to move very slowly as the plane continued flying toward Colorado Springs. Sarah spent those precious minutes reviewing everything she knew about landing procedures. She closed her eyes for a moment and pictured herself successfully bringing the aircraft down safely. Her father had always told her that visualization was an important part of flying. The passengers in the cabin could sense that something unusual was happening. Flight attendant Williams had made another announcement, explaining that they would be making an emergency landing. But she hadn't mentioned that a teenage passenger was now helping to fly the plane. Most people assumed that air traffic control or another pilot was providing remote assistance. Sarah's grandmother had always said that everything happens for a reason. As the plane began its approach to Colorado Springs Airport, Sarah wondered if all those hours she had spent studying aircraft manuals and practicing in flight simulators had been preparing her for this exact moment. She took a deep breath and prepared for the most important landing of her young life. The approach to Colorado Springs Airport was the longest 20 minutes of Sarah's life. Air traffic controller Mike Stevens had been guiding aircraft for 15 years. But he had never dealt with a situation like this. A teenager was attempting to land a commercial aircraft while the trained pilots lay sick in their seats. Stevens spoke slowly and clearly over the radio, giving Sarah step-by-step instructions. He had contacted the airline's emergency response team, and they had patched in Captain Lisa Park, one of the company's most experienced pilots, who was currently on the ground in Dallas. Captain Park would provide technical guidance while Stevens handled the approach coordination. Sarah's hands gripped the control yoke tightly as she began following the controller's directions. The first step was to reduce the aircraft's altitude gradually. She pulled back slightly on the throttles, feeling the plane respond to her input. The Boeing 737 was much larger and heavier than the small planes she was used to flying, but the basic principles were the same. In the passenger cabin, people were beginning to realize that this was more than a routine emergency landing. The flight attendants were moving through the aisles, checking that everyone's seatbelts were fastened and explaining the crash position. Jessica Williams tried to keep her voice calm, but passengers could hear the tension underneath her professional demeanor. Dr. Hayes continued monitoring both pilots. Captain Rodriguez's condition had stabilized somewhat, though he remained weak and disoriented. Co-pilot Chen was fighting to stay alert, providing what guidance he could to Sarah between waves of nausea and dizziness. Neither man was well enough to take control of the aircraft, but they could still offer crucial advice. The elderly woman who had been sitting next to Sarah was now gripping her knitting needles so tightly that her knuckles were white. She had raised 5 children and survived many difficult situations in her 78 years, but nothing had prepared her for this. She found herself praying for the brave young girl who had walked to the front of the plane. Captain Park's voice came through the radio clearly. She explained to Sarah that landing a commercial aircraft was like parking a very large car in a very specific spot. The key was to approach slowly and steadily, making small adjustments rather than dramatic movements. Sarah listened carefully, trying to absorb every piece of advice. The weather at Colorado Springs was cooperating. The wind was light, visibility was excellent, and there were no storms in the area. These were ideal conditions for landing, which increased their chances of success. Sarah felt grateful for this small piece of good luck in an otherwise terrifying situation. As the plane descended through 15,000 feet, Sarah could see the airport in the distance. It looked impossibly small from their current altitude. Just a tiny strip of concrete, surrounded by empty land. She tried not to think about how many things could go wrong during the next few minutes. Air traffic control had cleared all other aircraft from the area. Emergency vehicles were positioned along the runway. Fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue teams. The airport had activated its full emergency response protocol. Everyone was hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst. Sarah's father had taught her that flying was mostly about staying calm and thinking clearly. He had made her practice emergency scenarios over and over in their training sessions. She tried to remember his voice telling her to breathe deeply and focus on one task at a time. The businessman who had been sitting next to Sarah was now watching out his window as the ground grew closer. He worked for an aerospace company and knew enough about aviation to understand how difficult this landing would be. He found himself impressed by the courage of the young woman who had volunteered to help when everyone else was too scared or inexperienced. Co-pilot Chen managed to explain the landing configuration to Sarah. She would need to lower the landing gear and extend the flaps to slow the aircraft down. These were critical steps that had to be performed at exactly the right time and altitude. Chen's hands were too shaky to operate the controls himself, but he could guide Sarah through the process. At 8,000 feet, Sarah began configuring the aircraft for landing. Following Chen's instructions, she lowered the landing gear. The plane shuddered slightly as the wheels extended, and she could hear the mechanical sounds of the hydraulic systems working. Everything seemed to be functioning normally. Captain Park's voice came through the radio again. She reminded Sarah to watch her airspeed carefully. Too fast, and the plane would overshoot the runway. Too slow, and it would stall and crash. The target speed for landing was about 140 miles per hour, which seemed incredibly fast to Sarah but was actually quite normal for a commercial aircraft. The passengers could now see individual buildings and cars on the ground. Many people were looking out their windows, watching the earth rise up to meet them. Some were praying quietly. Others were holding hands with strangers. The entire cabin had fallen silent, except for the sound of the engines and the occasional instruction from the flight attendants. Sarah was now flying the aircraft manually. The autopilot had been disengaged, and she had complete control over their fate. Her training had taught her about the different phases of landing, but experiencing it in real life was completely different. The plane felt massive and powerful beneath her hands. At 5,000 feet, she extended the flaps partially. The aircraft slowed down and became more stable. Chen nodded weakly, indicating that she was doing everything correctly. Dr. Jen Rai. Dr. Hayes glanced up from checking Captain Rodriguez's vital signs and gave Sarah an encouraging smile. The runway was clearly visible now, stretching out in front of them like a long gray ribbon. Sarah could see the emergency vehicles positioned along its edges. She tried not to think about why they were there. Instead, she focused on the instructions coming through her headset. Air traffic controller Stevens was coordinating with the emergency teams while simultaneously guiding Sarah through the approach. He had moved other controllers aside and was handling all communication with Flight 447 personally. His voice remained calm and professional, even though he knew that any mistake could be catastrophic. At 3,000 feet, Sarah extended the flaps fully. The plane slowed down significantly and dropped toward the runway at a steeper angle. This was the most critical phase of the approach. She had to maintain exactly the right speed and altitude while lining up perfectly with the center line of the runway. Captain Park continued providing guidance over the radio. She reminded Sarah to keep the wings level and to make small corrections rather than large movements. The Boeing 737 was stable and forgiving, but it still required precise control during landing. Sarah could see people on the ground now. Airport workers and emergency personnel were watching their approach. She knew that her family back home in Chicago had no idea what was happening. Her parents thought she was safely on her way to visit her aunt, not attempting to land a commercial aircraft. The plane passed through 2,000 feet. Sarah's training had taught her about the concept of being stabilized on approach, maintaining the correct speed, altitude, and alignment with the runway. She was doing well, but she knew that the most difficult part was still ahead of her. Co-pilot Chen forced himself to stay alert despite his illness. He watched the instruments carefully, ready to alert Sarah if anything went wrong. Captain Rodriguez, though still weak, was also monitoring the approach. Both men were amazed by Sarah's composure and skill. At 1,000 feet, Sarah could see individual details on the runway. The painted lines, the approach lights, the emergency vehicles. Everything was becoming real and immediate. Her heart was pounding, but her hands remained steady on the controls. Jessica Williams made a final announcement to the passengers, instructing everyone to assume the crash position when she gave the signal. She explained that this was a precautionary measure and that they should remain calm. Her voice was remarkably steady, considering the circumstances. The plane crossed the runway threshold at exactly the right altitude and speed. Sarah could feel the ground effect as the aircraft entered the cushion of air, compressed between the wings and the runway surface. This was it. The moment of truth was only seconds away. Captain Park's voice came through the radio one final time before landing. She told Sarah that she was doing perfectly and to trust her instincts. The approach looked good from the ground, and everyone was confident in her ability to complete the landing safely. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to bring Flight 447 home. The runway stretched out in front of them, waiting. In just a few more seconds, she would either be a hero or part of a tragedy. She gripped the controls tighter and focused on the task that would determine the fate of everyone on board. The main landing gear touched the runway with a firm but controlled impact. Sarah felt the plane settle onto the concrete as she pulled back on the throttles and deployed the speed brakes. The aircraft was moving at over 130 miles per hour, but it was on the ground and under control. The passengers erupted in cheers and applause as they felt the wheels make contact with the runway. The elderly woman who had been sitting next to Sarah burst into tears of relief. The businessman closed his laptop and applauded along with everyone else. After the terror and uncertainty of the past hour, they were finally safe. But Sarah's job wasn't finished yet. She still had to bring the massive aircraft to a complete stop without running off the end of the runway. The Boeing 737 had tremendous momentum, and stopping it required careful application of the wheel brakes and reverse thrust systems. Co-pilot Chen, despite his illness, managed to help Sarah activate the thrust reversers. These systems redirected the engine power forward instead of backward, helping to slow the plane more quickly. Sarah could feel the deceleration as the aircraft responded to the braking systems. Air traffic controller Stevens watched from the tower as Flight 447 rolled down the runway. The landing had looked perfect from his vantage point, but he held his breath until the plane came to a complete stop. When the aircraft finally halted about 2/3 of the way down the runway, he allowed himself a moment of celebration. Captain Park, still connected by radio from Dallas, congratulated Sarah on an outstanding landing. Her voice was filled with emotion as she told the teenager that she had just accomplished something that most professional pilots would find extremely challenging. Sarah had not only saved her own life, but the lives of 155 other people. The emergency vehicles that had been positioned along the runway immediately sprang into action. Paramedics rushed to board the aircraft to treat Captain Rodriguez and co-pilot Chen. Fire trucks stood by as a precaution, though their services were thankfully not needed. Sarah remained in the co-pilot's seat for several minutes after landing, her hands still gripping the controls. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the emergency was beginning to wear off, and the magnitude of what she had just accomplished was starting to sink in. Jessica Williams placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and told her that she was an absolute hero. Dr. Hayes quickly examined Sarah to make sure she hadn't suffered any medical effects from the stress of the situation. The teenager was physically fine, though understandably shaken by the experience. The doctor marveled at how calm and focused Sarah had remained throughout the entire emergency. The passengers were evacuated from the aircraft using the normal boarding stairs rather than emergency slides, since there was no immediate danger. As people filed off the plane, many stopped to thank Sarah personally. Some were crying, others were laughing with relief, and all of them seemed amazed that such a young person had been responsible for their safe arrival. News crews arrived at Colorado Springs Airport within hours of the landing. The story of a 17-year-old girl successfully landing a commercial aircraft spread rapidly across the internet and television networks. Reporters wanted to interview Sarah, but she was still too overwhelmed to speak publicly about her experience. Captain Rodriguez and co-pilot Chen were rushed to a local hospital, where doctors determined that they had suffered from severe food poisoning, likely from something they had eaten at the airport before departure. Their symptoms had mimicked those of a stroke or other neurological emergency, but they were expected to make a full recovery. The Federal Aviation Administration immediately launched an investigation into the incident. They needed to understand exactly what had happened and ensure that proper procedures had been followed during the emergency. Sarah's actions would be scrutinized by aviation experts to determine whether she had made the right decisions. Sarah's parents in Chicago learned about the incident when a reporter called their house looking for a comment. They had been going about their normal Tuesday routine, completely unaware that their daughter had just performed one of the most remarkable feats in aviation history. They immediately drove to the airport to catch the next flight to Colorado. The airline's chief executive officer personally called Sarah to thank her for her actions. He explained that the company would be conducting its own investigation, but that initial reports indicated she had performed flawlessly under impossible circumstances. He offered to pay for her flight training if she wanted to pursue a career in aviation. Sarah's flying instructor back in Chicago was stunned when he heard the news. He remembered her as a dedicated and talented student, but he had never imagined that she would put her skills to such an extraordinary test. He told reporters that Sarah had always been exceptionally calm and focused during training flights. The elderly woman who had been knitting in seat 17 sought out Sarah before leaving the airport. Her name was Margaret Thompson, and she was a retired school teacher. She told Sarah that she had taught thousands of students over the years, but had never met anyone with such courage and composure. She predicted that Sarah would accomplish great things in her life. Over the following days, aviation experts analyzed every aspect of Sarah's landing. The consensus was unanimous. She had performed the approach and touchdown with the skill of a veteran commercial pilot. Her decision-making had been sound, her technique was correct, and her composure under pressure was extraordinary. The incident prompted discussions within the aviation industry about emergency procedures and pilot training. Some experts suggested that having basic flight training information available to passengers could be beneficial in extreme situations, while others argued that what Sarah had accomplished was so rare that it couldn't be planned for. Sarah's aunt in Denver, whom she had originally been traveling to visit, drove to Colorado Springs to reunite with her niece. She had been worried when Sarah's flight was diverted, but had no idea of the dramatic circumstances involved. When she learned what had happened, she could hardly believe that her quiet, studious niece had become an international hero. The story inspired millions of people around the world. Sarah received thousands of letters and emails from people thanking her for her bravery. Aviation enthusiasts praised her technical skill, while parents pointed to her as an example of how young people could rise to meet extraordinary challenges. Several major airlines offered Sarah internships and training opportunities. Aircraft manufacturers invited her to visit their facilities and learn about airplane design and engineering. Flight schools offered her scholarships to complete her pilot's license. The teenager, who had been afraid of flying, suddenly found herself at the center of the aviation world. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from her fellow passengers. They organized a reunion dinner 6 months after the incident, and every person who had been on Flight 447 attended. They presented Sarah with a plaque that read, "To our guardian angel at 30,000 feet. With eternal gratitude from the passengers of Flight 447. Sarah eventually did pursue a career in aviation, inspired by her extraordinary experience. She became a commercial airline pilot and later a flight instructor, always emphasizing to her students the importance of staying calm under pressure and never giving up, even when situations seem impossible. The incident became a case study in aviation schools around the world. Student pilots learned about Sarah's decision-making process and the factors that contributed to her successful landing. Her story demonstrated that knowledge, preparation, and composure could overcome even the most daunting challenges. Years later, Sarah would reflect on that October day and realize that it had changed not only her own life, but the lives of everyone who had been on board Flight 447. She had discovered strength and capability within herself that she never knew existed, and she had learned that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. Captain Rodriguez and co-pilot Chen both returned to flying after their recovery. They remained grateful to Sarah for the rest of their careers and often spoke about the teenage girl who had saved their lives and the lives of their passengers. They became advocates for improved emergency medical protocols for flight crews. The Boeing 737 that Sarah had landed was thoroughly inspected and returned to service. A small plaque was installed in the cockpit commemorating the emergency landing. Though most passengers who flew on the aircraft in subsequent years never knew about its remarkable history, Sarah's story became a symbol of hope and human potential. It showed that age and experience, while important, were not the only factors that determined what someone could accomplish. Sometimes, courage and determination were more valuable than years of training. The girl who had been afraid of flying became a symbol of aviation excellence. Her journey from passenger to pilot in the span of a single flight remained one of the most inspiring stories in the history of commercial aviation. She proved that heroes could emerge from anywhere, even from seat 17 on a routine Tuesday morning flight.